Picture a major city center right at golden hour. But instead of the usual bustling crowds, honking cabs, and packed sidewalks, the streets are eerily quiet. The towering skyscrapers are still there, casting these massive long shadows. But the people who used to fill them, well, they're working from their living rooms, hundreds of miles away. It kind of sounds like a scene from a dystopian movie, right? But it's actually the very real crisis facing modern metropolises all across the globe today. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking an investigative look into a massive structural shift in our urban environments.
The office real estate apocalypse. That is a direct, pretty ominous warning from Stein von Neuerberg, a professor at Columbia Business School. He's actually the researcher who coined the term we're going to unpack today. So let's dive right into this. When the pandemic hit back in 2020, it didn't just empty buildings for a few weeks. It fundamentally broke the traditional 9-to-5 commuter model. Remote work went from being this rare perk to a permanent structural shift. By the time the pandemic subsided, the share of people working from home in places like San Francisco jumped by 20 percentage points, up to 27%. That is not a blip. It triggered a cascade of economic consequences that literally threatened the survival of our downtowns.
Which brings us to the core attention we're exploring today. Are our greatest cities caught in an inescapable spiral of permanent urban decline? Or, on the flip side, does this massive disruption actually hold the potential for a radical rebirth? To figure out how we end up at either extreme, we have to look at the invisible economic engines that make cities work in the first place.
Section 1. The remote work shock, a structural shift. To understand why remote work is such a massive threat to a city's bottom line, we really have to understand the underlying mechanics of what makes a city valuable. The crucial point here is a concept called urban agglomeration. Now, I know that sounds highly technical, but it basically just means the geographical co-location of employees and companies. Think about it. When you pack a ton of smart, driven people and competing companies into the same dense geographic area, you generate massive productivity benefits. People share ideas over coffee, labor markets become super flexible, and supply chains get highly efficient. It's like an economic super engine. But remote work creates an agglomeration gap. When those workers stay home, all those in-person productivity benefits, they just vanish. In New York City alone, researchers estimate that the direct loss in economic returns from this agglomeration gap could amount to a staggering $17.2 billion annually.
And you can actually see how that loss of in-person activity physically manifests in our skylines. Just take a look at these vacancy rates. We are seeing office vacancies surging well past 20%. I mean, look at Atlanta at 24.3%, Boston at 24.1%, and Dallas at 21.5%. In Manhattan, the vacancy rate hit its absolute highest level since they started keeping track back in 1987. With almost a quarter of commercial office space sitting completely empty, the financial foundation of these cities is really starting to crack.
Section 2. Anatomy of a doom loop, the vicious cycle. So what actually happens when all those buildings stay empty? Well, it sets off a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. It starts at step 1 with high office vacancy. Because there's less demand, companies downsize. Which brings us to step 2, lost real estate value. Commercial buildings simply aren't worth what they used to be. And that directly triggers step 3, tax shortfalls. You see, cities rely heavily on property taxes from these massive commercial buildings. When their values plummet, the city's tax revenue collapses right along with it. To balance the budget, the city is forced into step 4, service cuts. They have to cut public transit, street cleaning, and safety programs, which, as you can guess, inevitably leads to step 5, urban flight. The city becomes a less appealing, less safe place to live and work, so more residents and businesses leave, pushing us right back to step 1. The whole loop just feeds itself.
Section 3. Ground Zero, Sacramento, the state hub impact.
Let's step out of the theoretical for a second and look at a concrete case study. Outside of Washington, D.C., no city center in the country is more impacted by government remote work policies than Sacramento, California. Just think about this. 40% of downtown Sacramento's entire office inventory is made up of state buildings. For decades, the viability of the city relied entirely on the 70,000 state workers who commuted downtown every single day. Each one of those daytime employees contributed on average almost $3,000 a year to the local economy. So when those state workers were sent home in March 2020, the local ecosystem basically starved. Over 50 locally owned businesses closed, 20 in the first year alone. Dining, entertainment, retail, it all evaporated almost overnight. The devastation on the ground is truly striking. Over on the left, notice the massive drop in commercial real estate assessed values. Retail property values per square foot dropped significantly. And then on the right, look at the staggering collapse in downtown foot traffic from 2019 to 2022. Those orange bars represent the vibrant foot traffic of 2019, and the red bars, they show the dramatic hollowing out by 2022. Pedestrian counts dropped massively. Without people walking the streets, buying lunches, or going to after-work happy hours, the city center was left incredibly vulnerable.
I really want you to just take a second and look at this number, $2.7 billion. That is the projected real estate loss in Sacramento over a 20-year period, directly due to the shift to remote work. The loss of the daytime workforce alone will lead to over $1 billion in revenue loss to the city over that exact same time frame. Let that sink in. This isn't just a temporary dip we're talking about. It's a massive structural realignment of capital.
Section 4, the tax revenue ripple, municipal budget crisis.
As tough as this is for local businesses, the crisis quickly scales up to municipal budgets, threatening the very survival of the city apparatus itself. Let's look at Boston. A recent report estimated that inflation-adjusted commercial property values in Boston could fall by 35% to 45%. That kind of drop would reduce tax revenue by roughly $1.7 billion by 2029. We're impartially reporting on a very severe fiscal cliff here. City officials across the country are facing an incredibly tough mathematical reality. When commercial property taxes evaporate, cities basically only have two levers they can pull. They either have to drastically cut public services, or they have to significantly raise residential property taxes to make up the difference. Obviously, neither option is politically or economically desirable, and both risk accelerating that doom loop of urban flight. And by the way, this isn't just an American problem. Major global metropolitans, like London, are facing very similar hollowing out effects and severe fiscal pressures as remote work persists.
Section 5, engineering the boom loop, a path to renewal.
But what if this isn't the end of the story? What if the very catalyst of this crisis, empty buildings, is actually the key to an urban renaissance? Let's contrast two very different potential futures. On one hand, we have the doom loop, high vacancy, falling revenue, urban flight. But on the other hand, we have the potential for a virtuous boom loop. In this scenario, cities prosper by adapting. Firms use remote work for tasks that don't require physical presence, optimizing efficiency. Meanwhile, cities take those vacant, dead office spaces and totally repurpose them. They convert them into housing, which lowers housing costs, and transforms 9-to-5 commuter zones into 24/7 thriving complete neighborhoods. By leaning into this flexibility, cities can actually trigger a really powerful cycle of renewal. And this brings us right back to Stein van Nieuwerburgh. He estimates that between 30% to 40% of New York's office space could be viably transformed into desperately needed, wonderful housing. Think about the sheer scale of that. We're talking about millions of square feet of real estate that is currently just sitting idle, generating absolutely zero economic value, being transformed to directly address the acute housing shortages that plague our superstar cities. It's a real game changer.
Now, obviously, you can't just snap your fingers and turn an office building into an apartment. It requires some very specific policy changes to make these conversions an actionable reality for developers. First, zoning reforms, like New York's City of Yes initiative, which removes outdated regulatory barriers. Second, lifting floor area ratio, or FAR caps, that strictly limit residential density. Third, providing targeted tax incentives, like the 46(7)M program. Because, let's be real, stripping a massive office building down to its studs and replumbing the whole thing for residential units is incredibly expensive. And finally, cities are creating office conversion accelerator programs, basically fast-tracking permits across multiple city agencies just to get these projects off the ground.
If you're sitting there wondering if this boom loop can actually work in the real world, well, we just have to look at the Dallas blueprint. Over the last 2 decades, Dallas didn't just talk about it, they used tax increment financing and historic rehabilitation tax exemptions to aggressively repurpose space. They converted about 40 downtown buildings. They turned old skyscrapers into mixed-use buildings with apartments, hotels, and restaurants. They even turned a 1920 Sears distribution center into affordable apartments. And the result? The Central Business District went from a population of just a few hundred people in the year 2000 to roughly 15,000 residents today. They completely successfully turned a depressed commuter hub into a vibrant living neighborhood. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question. Will our city centers remain empty relics of a 9-to-5 era that, quite frankly, no longer exists? Or are local leaders, developers, and citizens brave enough to strip away the red tape and build the resilient, dynamic neighborhoods of tomorrow? The buildings are right there, waiting to be reimagined. The path your city takes, doom or boom, well, it's being decided right now.